When I first bought my home in Maplewood Estates, I imagined a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where I could finally enjoy peace after years in the city. The backyard was my sanctuary. 2 acres of open land that sloped gently toward a row of whispering pines. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Or so I thought. 3 months after moving in, I came home from a weekend trip to find a flurry of activity beyond my fence. A crew of workers in orange vests were unloading bright plastic slides, metal poles, and wood chips. Kids were running around excitedly, parents chatting nearby. My confusion turned to disbelief when I saw the sign being staked into the ground. Maplewood Estates Community Playground, sponsored by HOA. I marched straight to the site manager. "Excuse me," I said, pointing toward the freshly poured concrete foundation. "This is my property." He looked at his clipboard, then back at me with a faint smirk. "According to the HOA, this section is designated common space." Common space? That was news to me. My deed clearly outlined the property boundaries. And that corner, where they were installing swings, was well within my lot line. I called the HOA office immediately. After 3 hours of being transferred between smug representatives, I finally spoke to the president, a man named Carl Benson, whose voice dripped with bureaucratic arrogance. "Mr. Dalton," he said, "there's been some confusion regarding the boundary survey. But since the area has been designated for community use, we'll proceed as planned. Of course, you're welcome to enjoy the playground too. Enjoy it. On my land." That night, I stood by the window, staring at the half-finished playground glowing under floodlights. I'd worked 30 years to buy this property. And now the HOA had simply decided part of it belonged to them. I wasn't the kind of man to pick fights, but this was personal. By the next morning, I'd already called a surveyor. The report came back crystal clear: the playground was entirely on my land. I sent copies to the HOA along with a cease and desist letter. Their response arrived a week later. A notice threatening me with fines for obstructing community development. I laughed out loud. They thought they could bully me into compliance. Well, they'd just picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. If they wanted a fight over land, I'd give them one. But not the way they expected. Because that spring, I decided I wasn't tearing down the playground, I was going to repurpose it. The idea came to me one restless night as I stared out at the empty swing set swaying in the wind. The playground had been completed, but the novelty had already worn off. Parents complained about mosquitoes. Kids preferred video games. And the once busy community area had become eerily quiet. That's when I thought, if they built something on my land, I'd simply use it my way. I began small, a few tomato plants where the sandbox had been. Herbs and planters beneath the slide. By June, I had rows of lettuce, peppers, and carrots sprouting between the swings. I installed a short, tasteful fence. Not to keep people out, but to define what was now my farm. When the HOA board came knocking, I met them with a smile. Carl Benson was at the front, red-faced and indignant. "Mr. Dalton, this playground is community property," he began. "Actually," I said, waving the survey report in his face, "it's mine. You built on my land without consent. I'm merely using what's mine." He sputtered something about violations and uncooperative behavior. But I didn't care. I had something better than anger, proof. That summer, my backyard became the talk of Maplewood Estates. Neighbors who had ignored me for months now wandered by to admire the thriving green rows. Kids picked strawberries instead of playing on swings. Even the elderly couple down the street brought me homemade pies in exchange for fresh kale. The HOA sent warning letters, then fines, then threats of legal action. But every time they tried, I countered with documentation and photographs. The more they fought, the more I expanded. By late summer, I'd built a small greenhouse, using the old jungle gym frame as support. The irony wasn't lost on me. Word spread beyond the neighborhood. Local newspapers picked up the story. Homeowner turns HOA playground into urban farm. My produce stand set up by the curb every Saturday, became a hit. The same residents who once backed the HOA now lined up to buy my organic vegetables. Carl and his board were furious, but legally, they were cornered. The land was mine, the survey proved it. And every attempt to challenge me only drew more public sympathy. I wasn't just growing vegetables anymore, I was growing defiance. And it tasted sweeter than anything I'd ever harvested before. By the following spring, my farm had outgrown its modest beginnings. I'd added beehives where the picnic tables once stood. And rows of sunflowers now bordered the fence. The old monkey bars supported climbing beans. What was once a monument to HOA arrogance had transformed into a lush, self-sustaining garden that drew visitors from neighboring communities. But with success came escalation. The HOA called an emergency meeting, inviting every homeowner, including me. The room buzzed with tension as Carl Benson stood at the front, sweating under fluorescent lights. "Mr. Dalton's farm," he began, forcing the word out, "is in violation of several HOA regulations, including zoning restrictions and aesthetic standards." I stood up calmly. "Perhaps you mean your violation, building a playground without consent. You've already been served notice of trespass." Gasps rippled through the room. Carl's jaw tightened. "You can't sue your own HOA." "Oh, I can," I said. "And I have." The next morning, I filed an official complaint with the county property office. The surveyor's report, the photos, the HOA's written threats, everything went into the record. It wasn't just about a playground anymore. It was about property rights. Meanwhile, life on the farm continued. Bees thrived, tomatoes ripened, and neighbors volunteered to help. What began as protest had become a community movement, one that excluded the HOA entirely. Then came the inspection. Carl arrived with 2 county officials, clearly expecting them to shut me down. But after walking the property, the inspector turned to him and said, "Mr. Dalton's use of his land is fully compliant. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." Carl's face drained of color. The ruling sent shockwaves through Maplewood Estates. The HOA had overstepped its authority, publicly and legally. They were forced to rescind every fine and remove the community playground designation from my deed. But I wasn't done. I hung a new sign on the gate that week. "Dalton Farms, locally grown, legally owned." Within months, I had a small business license, a steady stream of customers, and a waiting list for my honey and produce boxes. What had started as a fight over stolen land had turned into something beautiful, something sustainable. Carl tried to save face, but his power was gone. The board dissolved within the year, replaced by a new one that actually listened to residents. And every time I looked out at the thriving fields that once were swings and slides, I smiled. I hadn't just won, I'd transformed their mistake into my victory. 2 years later, Maplewood Estates was almost unrecognizable. Where the HOA's old regime once ruled with clipboards and fines, a spirit of cooperation had taken root. My farm stood at the heart of it all, no longer a battleground, but a gathering place. Every Saturday, families came to pick produce. Kids learned to plant seeds. And the elderly shared gardening tips. The same land the HOA tried to claim had become the community's pride. On my terms. I'd expanded beyond vegetables. Chickens clucked in a small coop near the fence line. Their eggs sold at a local market. Bees pollinated the sunflowers, ensuring honey harvests twice a year. The once bare slope was now alive with color, buzzing with life. Then, one morning, I received a letter. It was from Carl Benson. He'd moved away after losing the HOA presidency. But the tone of the letter was surprisingly humble. "Mr. Dalton," it began, "I wanted to say that, in hindsight, you were right. You turned conflict into creation. I hope Maplewood knows how lucky they are." I read it twice, then tucked it into a drawer. Maybe he'd learned something after all. That autumn, I hosted the first ever Maplewood harvest fair on my property, the same ground once claimed as a playground. There were food stalls, live music, and kids carving pumpkins beside the old jungle gym frame, now draped in grapevines. Local officials attended. congratulating us on turning controversy into community. As the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, I stood by the gate, watching families laugh and neighbors mingle. I thought about how it all started, a reckless decision by an overreaching HOA. A playground built without permission. What they'd meant as a symbol of control had become the seed of independence. In the end, I didn't need revenge. The best justice was letting something beautiful grow from their arrogance. Every harvest reminded me that ownership isn't about paperwork or politics, it's about care, persistence, and the will to stand your ground. Maplewood Estates would always remember the day the HOA tried to take my land. But they'd remember even more vividly what grew in its place. A farm born from defiance, rooted in principle, and nourished by the quiet satisfaction of victory. And as for me, I just kept planting. Because sometimes, the best way to reclaim your land is to let it flourish.